Welcome back to another epic journey through the world of Westeros, where we explore the paths not taken and the fates that could have been. If you're ready to dive deep into one of the most game-changing what-if scenarios in Game of Thrones history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible alternate timelines that will reshape everything you thought you knew about the Seven Kingdoms. The executioner's blade gleamed in the morning sun above the great sept of Baelor. Thousands of small folk had gathered to witness what they believed would be the end of Ned Stark, the Wolf of Winterfell. Joffrey Baratheon, boy king and bastard born of sin, raised his hand with cruel delight dancing in his emerald eyes. The crowd held its breath. Sansa Stark screamed for mercy. Arya Stark pushed through the masses, her small hands reaching desperately toward her father. But in that moment, as steel descended toward the neck of the most honorable man in Westeros, fate itself seemed to shudder and change course. What if I told you that Ned Stark never died that day? What if the Wolf of Winterfell lived to see another dawn, another battle, another chance to reshape the very foundations of the Iron Throne? What if his survival sent shockwaves through every great house from Dawn to the Wall, turning allies into enemies and enemies into the most unlikely of saviors? This is not the story you know. This is not the tale of an honorable fool who played the Game of Thrones with noble intentions and paid the ultimate price. This is the story of a man who stared death in the face and lived to tell about it, whose survival would ignite a fire that would burn across all seven kingdoms and beyond. In the moments after that blade should have fallen, as chaos erupted in King's Landing and word spread like wildfire through the realm, no one could have predicted the avalanche of consequences that would follow. The War of Five Kings would become something entirely different. Ancient prophecies would stir in the darkness beyond the wall, and the Game of Thrones itself would transform into something far more dangerous and complex than anyone had ever imagined. But how did he survive? Who intervened in that crucial moment when death seemed certain? Was it loyalty, cunning, divine intervention, or something far more sinister? The answer lies buried beneath layers of conspiracy that reach back generations, involving players whose names are whispered in the shadows and whose motives remain hidden even from the spider's web of informants. Tonight we will uncover the truth behind the most shocking survival in Westeros history. We will follow Ned Stark as he navigates a world that believes him dead, as he learns to play a game he once despised, and as he discovers that his survival was not accident but necessity for a purpose far greater than he could ever imagine. The wolf was meant to die that day, but some wolves are too important to the pack to perish so easily. The morning air in King's Landing carried the acrid scent of fear and anticipation as thousands of small folk pressed against the barriers surrounding the great sept of Baelor. Stone walls that had witnessed countless prayers and ceremonies now bore witness to what should have been the execution of the North's most revered lord. The marble steps, polished smooth by centuries of pilgrims, gleamed white in the harsh sunlight, soon to be stained red with noble blood. But fate, it seems, had other plans for Ned Stark. As the executioner's sword began its deadly arc, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. Black Brothers of the Night's Watch, led by the grizzled recruiter Yoren, burst through the masses with desperate fury. Yoren himself, a man who had seen countless horrors beyond the wall, moved with purpose that spoke of debts owed and honor upheld. In his weathered hands he carried a royal decree bearing the seal of the late King Robert Baratheon. The blade stopped mere inches from Ned's neck. By order of King Robert Baratheon, Yoren's voice thundered across the sept. This man is claimed for the wall. The Night's Watch has need of his sword, and the realm has need of the watch. Confusion rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Joffrey's face twisted with rage, his boyish features contorting into something truly monstrous. The young king's voice cracked as he screamed protests, but the damage was already done. Doubt had been planted. questions arose. The High Septon himself stepped forward, his ornate robes rustling as he examined the decree with trembling fingers. In that moment of chaos, as guards hesitated and nobles whispered, Ned Stark's eyes met those of his eldest daughter. Sansa stood frozen among the crowd, her face a mask of desperate hope and terror. Behind her, pressed against a pillar, Arya's small form trembled with barely contained energy, her hand instinctively reaching for Needle, the sword her father had allowed her to keep. The decree bore Robert's authentic seal, but more importantly, it carried the subtle marks of forgery that only the most skilled could detect. Someone with access to the royal chambers, someone with knowledge of the king's private writings, someone who moved in shadows and spoke in whispers, had orchestrated this moment with surgical precision. Yoren's weathered face betrayed nothing as he approached the execution block. Behind him, a dozen black brothers formed a protective circle, their faces grim but determined. These were not the usual dregs and criminals who typically took the black. These men moved with military precision, their eyes scanning the crowd for threats, their hands resting casually on sword hilts. "The boy king may wear the crown," Yoren declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. "But the Night's Watch answers to no southern ruler. This man's crimes are forgiven in service to the realm's true protectors." The transformation began immediately. Rough hands cut Ned's bonds, replacing silk and velvet with the coarse black wool of the Night's Watch. A hood was pulled over his distinctive features, and suddenly, Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Hand of the King, ceased to exist. In his place stood a nameless brother of the Night's Watch, one among many who had sacrificed everything for the realm's protection. But as the group moved through King's Landing's winding streets, Ned caught glimpses of faces in the crowd. Not all were strangers. A gold cloak here, a servant there, eyes that lingered just a moment too long before looking away. Someone had prepared for this moment, had placed pieces on the board long before the game began. The safe house lay hidden in the warren of streets near Flea Bottom, far from the Red Keep's watchful towers. Here, in a nondescript building that might have belonged to any common tradesman, Ned Stark would begin his transformation from honorable lord to hunted survivor. The room smelled of old wool and lamp oil, its small windows covered with thick cloth that blocked prying eyes. Yoren removed his own cloak and settled into a chair that had clearly been prepared for this meeting. His eyes, sharp, despite his gruff appearance, studied Ned with an intensity that spoke of intelligence far beyond what most would credit to a recruiter for the Wall. "You're wondering who sent me," Yoren said, without preamble. "You're wondering how a decree bearing a dead king's seal could appear at just the right moment. You're wondering why the Night's Watch would risk open defiance of the Iron Throne for one man." Ned's throat, still raw from the rough hemp rope, barely managed a whisper. "Because Lord Stark, your death would have been the end of more than just House Stark. There are forces moving in this realm, ancient powers stirring beyond the Wall, and games within games that make Cersei Lannister's schemes look like children's play. You were meant to survive today, though the reasons will become clear only when the time is right." Outside the small window, King's Landing continued its daily rhythm, unaware that the Game of Thrones had just been forever altered by the survival of one honorable fool who was perhaps not quite as foolish as he seemed. The news of Ned Stark's disappearance spread through King's Landing like plague through a crowded slum. Within hours of the failed execution, every tavern, brothel, and marketplace buzzed with whispered theories. Some claimed they had seen the Lord of Winterfell's head roll across the Sept steps. Others swore the man who walked away in black was too tall, too broad, too alive to be anyone but Ned Stark himself. In the Red Keep's throne room, King Joffrey paced before the Iron Throne like a caged animal. His golden hair, so perfectly groomed that morning, now hung in disheveled strands across his flushed face. The ornate crown seemed too large for his young head, tilting with each agitated movement as he screamed orders that contradicted themselves with each breath. "Find him!" Joffrey shrieked at the assembled Kingsguard. "Bring me his head, or I'll have yours instead. No one makes a fool of the king. No one." Sir Meryn Trant, his scarred face impassive, bowed low. "Your Grace, the Night's Watch brothers vanished into the city. Our men search every street, every building." "Search harder," the boy king spat. "Tear down every hovel in Flea Bottom if you must. The wolf dies today, or someone else will." Behind the throne, Queen Regent Cersei Lannister stood motionless as carved marble, but her emerald eyes burned with calculations that would have impressed even Tywin Lannister himself. Her son's public tantrum was embarrassing, but manageable. The real problem lay in the implications of Ned's survival. Every great house in Westeros would now question the crown's authority. Every enemy would see weakness where strength should stand. "Joffrey," she said, her voice cutting through his rant like a blade through silk. "Enough." The young king turned toward his mother, his face twisted with petulant rage. "Mother, they made me look weak. They saved the traitor right in front of everyone. And your screaming like a fishwife's brat makes you look strong." Cersei's words struck like physical blows. "Sit down. Be quiet. Let me think." Meanwhile, in the bowels of the Red Keep, Grand Maester Pycelle shuffled through his chambers with unusual urgency. His normally steady hands trembled as he prepared ravens for flight, each message carefully crafted to serve multiple masters. To Old Town went word of political upheaval requiring the Citadel's guidance. To Casterly Rock traveled news that would reach Tywin Lannister's ears within days. But the most crucial message, written in a cipher known only to a select few, flew north toward River Run and beyond. Across the narrow sea of politics that separated the Red Keep's towers, Lord Varys glided through his network of secret passages with the fluid grace of his namesake spider. His soft slippers made no sound against stone floors as he gathered whispers from servants, guards, and noble ladies alike. Each conversation added another strand to the web of information he wove around the capital's power brokers. The eunuch's chambers, hidden deep beneath the keep, buzzed with activity as his little birds brought news from every corner of the city. Children who moved unseen through noble houses, servants who cleaned chambers while lords planned treason, whores who entertained men who spoke too freely after wine, all contributed to Varys' understanding of this new game. "The wolf lives," whispered a girl no older than 10, her face smudged with soot from kitchen fires. "Saw him walking toward Flea Bottom, all covered in black like the crows." Varys nodded, dropping a copper coin into her small palm. "And what of the Queen's men? Where do they search?" "Everywhere," the child replied. "But they look for a lord in silk, not a crow in wool." In Littlefinger's brothel, far from the Red Keep's watchful eyes, Petyr Baelish entertained a different sort of visitor. The man wore merchant's clothes, but his bearing spoke of noble birth and military training. They sat in a room where privacy was guaranteed by gold and the understanding that certain conversations never happened. "The plan proceeds as discussed," the visitor reported, his voice carefully neutral. "Yoren played his part perfectly. The decree was accepted without question." Littlefinger smiled, the expression never reaching his calculating eyes. "And our friend's current location? Secure. Hidden where even the spider's little birds cannot fly." "Excellent." Littlefinger poured wine from a bottle that cost more than most men earned in a year. "Phase 2 begins immediately. Send word to our contacts in the north. Robb Stark must believe his father died a hero's death. His rage will serve our purposes far better than his grief." But perhaps the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. In the Stark apartments of the Red Keep, Sansa Stark knelt in her solar, her hands clasped in desperate prayer. The 14-year-old girl, who had once dreamed of knights and courtly romance, now faced a reality far harsher than any song. Her father's survival meant hope, but it also meant her life had become infinitely more dangerous. Septa Mordain hovered nearby, her weathered face creased with worry. "Child, you must be careful, if they suspect you know anything about your father's escape." "I know nothing," Sansa replied, her voice stronger than her years should have allowed. "I am just a frightened girl who watched her father die." But even as she spoke the words, her mind raced with possibilities. If her father lived, if he moved through King's Landing like a ghost, then perhaps her nightmare might someday end. Arya Stark's reaction proved far more direct. The younger Stark daughter had not returned to the Red Keep after the execution. Instead, she moved through King's Landing streets like a feral cat, using skills learned from years of exploring Winterfell's hidden passages. She knew her father lived because she had seen him breathing when the Black Brothers led him away. Now she hunted for any trace of where they might have taken him. Her small size allowed her to squeeze through gaps in walls, to hide in shadows where grown men could not fit, to listen at windows where important conversations took place. Each piece of information she gathered added to her understanding of the web surrounding her family. In a tavern near the Street of Steel, she crouched beneath a table where two gold cloaks discussed their orders. "Commander says search every building twice," one muttered into his ale. "But half the lads think the Northmen's already dead and gone." "Dead men don't disappear," his companion replied. "Dead men leave bodies." This one walked away on his own feet. 3 leagues north of King's Landing, a raven arrived at an inn where travelers gathered before continuing their journeys. The bird bore no identifying marks, carried no official seals, but the message it delivered would change the course of kingdoms. The innkeeper, a man whose loyalty had been purchased years before with gold and promises, read the brief note twice before feeding it to his fire. Within hours, riders departed the inn heading in different directions. Some rode north toward the Riverlands, others east toward the Vale, still others west toward the Westerlands. Each carried the same message, encoded in merchants' language that spoke of grain prices and trade routes, but meant something entirely different to those who understood the cipher. The Game of Thrones had always been complex, but Ned Stark's survival introduced variables that no player had fully anticipated. In the north, Robb Stark prepared for war based on his father's presumed death. In the Riverlands, Catelyn Stark grieved for a husband she believed lost forever. In King's Landing, a boy king raged while his mother schemed and his enemies plotted. But in the shadows of Flea Bottom, in a room that officially did not exist, Eddard Stark began to understand that his survival was neither accident nor mercy. As night fell over the capital, he stared through a grimy window at the Red Keep's distant towers, and realized that everything he thought he knew about honor, loyalty, and the Game of Thrones was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. The wolf had been freed from one trap, only to discover he had stepped into another far more elaborate and dangerous than anything Cersei Lannister's simple mind could have devised. 3 days passed before Ned Stark dared venture beyond the walls of his hidden sanctuary. The coarse black wool of the Night's Watch had become his skin, the hood his shield against recognition. But survival required more than disguise. It demanded information, allies, and most crucially, an understanding of the forces that had orchestrated his rescue. Yoren had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving behind only cryptic warnings about trust and patience. The other Black brothers who had participated in the rescue proved equally elusive, melting back into King's Landing's vast population like shadows at dawn. Ned found himself alone in a city that believed him dead, surrounded by enemies who would kill him on sight if they discovered the truth. His first venture into the streets taught him harsh lessons about his new reality. The face that had once commanded respect throughout the 7 kingdoms now required careful concealment. He learned to walk differently, to slouch his shoulders and shuffle his feet like a man broken by years of hard service. He practiced speaking in the rough accent of the North's common folk, abandoning the refined speech that marked him as nobility. The transformation proved more difficult than he had anticipated. Every instinct screamed against the deception, against the lies and misdirection that seemed to come so naturally to men like Littlefinger and Varys. But necessity proved a harsh teacher, and Ned's desire to see his daughters safe again provided motivation stronger than honor. His first real intelligence came from an unexpected source. In a tavern frequented by off-duty gold cloaks, he overheard conversations that chilled his blood. The City Watch had been systematically purged of men loyal to House Stark. Captain Janos Slynt, already known for his corruption, had used Ned's supposed death as excuse to eliminate anyone who might question Lannister authority. Killed 3 of them just yesterday. One guard muttered into his ale, said they were asking too many questions about the execution. Captain don't like questions, especially questions about how the Night's Watch knew to be there. His companion added, "Been wondering about that myself." Ned filed away this information along with dozens of other fragments he gathered through careful listening. The Gold Cloaks feared their own leadership. Many had served honorably under previous commanders and chafed under Slynt's brutal rule. Here lay potential allies, men who might be turned if approached correctly. But the most valuable intelligence came from the servants who moved invisibly through the Red Keep's halls. Kitchen maids, stable boys, and chamber servants saw everything while being noticed by no one. Ned learned to frequent the markets where such people shopped, to listen at the public wells where they gathered to gossip. From a washwoman who cleaned the Queen's chambers, he learned that Cersei spent hours each day in heated discussions with her Uncle Kevin. Arguments that grew more intense as news arrived from the Riverlands. From a stable boy who cared for royal horses, he discovered that mysterious riders arrived at the Red Keep during the darkest hours of night. Men who spoke with foreign accents and carried themselves like soldiers. The picture that emerged from these fragments painted a realm balanced on the edge of chaos. Robb Stark had indeed called his banners, just as Ned had feared. The young wolf marched south with 20,000 swords, his fury at his father's supposed death, driving him toward a war that would consume the North's strength and leave it vulnerable to other threats. In the Riverlands, Catelyn had convinced her brother Edmure to call the Riverlords to Riverrun's defense. The Tully's ancient words, family, duty, honor, now rang across the fertile lands between the Trident's forks as lords who had kept peace for generations prepared once again for war. But perhaps most disturbing was the intelligence regarding King's Landing itself. The capital seethed with tension as common folk whispered about the mad boy king and his cruel mother. Public executions had increased dramatically, with Joffrey ordering deaths for increasingly minor offenses. The smell of fear permeated the city like a plague, and many spoke quietly of fleeing to the countryside before the inevitable violence erupted. Ned's investigation into his rescue proved more challenging. The royal decree that had saved his life bore all the proper seals and signatures, but something about the parchment nagged at his memory. The handwriting seemed familiar, though he could not place where he had seen it before. More troubling were the financial records he managed to glimpse through careful questioning of palace servants. Someone had paid substantial sums to specific gold cloaks in the days leading up to his execution. The payments were carefully disguised as gambling winnings and family gifts, but the pattern was clear to anyone who looked closely enough. A significant portion of the City Watch had been bought, their loyalty purchased with gold rather than earned through leadership. The identity of the purchaser remained maddeningly elusive. The gold bore no identifying marks. The transactions were handled through intermediaries, who themselves seemed to be working for other intermediaries. Each lead dissolved into shadows when pursued too closely, as if someone had anticipated exactly this type of investigation and prepared accordingly. His search for allies proved equally complex. Many of the servants and common folk showed genuine sympathy for the North and its traditions, but sympathy was far different from the willingness to risk their lives in active resistance. Fear of Lannister reprisals kept most potential allies silent, unwilling to commit to anything beyond passive assistance. However, Ned did identify several promising contacts. A blacksmith named Tobho Mott, who had trained Gendry, spoke carefully but meaningfully about the differences between true kings and usurpers. A tavern keeper in Flea Bottom named Chatia provided information about unusual activities in her establishment, meetings between well-dressed men who paid in gold and spoke in whispers. Most intriguingly, he made contact with members of King's Landing's small but influential community of northern expatriates. These were merchants, craftsmen, and minor nobles who had settled in the capital over the years, but maintained strong emotional ties to their homeland. They gathered informally in a shop that sold goods imported from White Harbor, sharing news from home and discussing the changing political situation. "The boy Robb rides to war," reported a fur trader who had recently traveled the King's Road. 20,000 swords follow his banner, maybe more. Every lord from the wall to the neck has declared for House Stark. And what of the king's response? Ned asked carefully, maintaining his disguise as a northern trader seeking news of his homeland. "Tywin Lannister marches from Casterly Rock with 30,000 men," came the grim reply. "The old lion means to crush the young wolf before he can grow into his strength." This intelligence confirmed Ned's worst fears. His survival had failed to prevent the very war he had hoped to avoid through his supposed death. Indeed, his son's belief in his father's execution seemed to have intensified the conflict rather than reducing it. The irony was bitter. In saving his life, his mysterious benefactors had potentially doomed thousands of others to death in the coming battles. Yet gradually, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from the intelligence he gathered. The timing of various events, the positioning of key players, the flow of gold and information, all suggested a level of coordination that spoke of planning far more sophisticated than anything Cersei Lannister could have orchestrated. Someone had wanted this war. Someone had carefully arranged circumstances to ensure that the North would rebel, that the Riverlands would support them, that the Lannisters would respond with overwhelming force. Ned's rescue was not an act of mercy or even political calculation. It was a chess move in a game whose rules he was only beginning to understand. The realization chilled him more than the knowledge of his enemy's hatred. If his survival served some greater purpose, if his rescue had been planned by forces with their own agenda, then he was not truly free. He had simply exchanged one form of captivity for another, perhaps more subtle but no less real. As he made his way back to his hidden sanctuary through King's Landing's twisting streets, Ned reflected on the bitter lessons of his first week as a hunted man. Honor might be the foundation of his character, but survival required skills he had never been taught in Winterfell's training yards. He was learning to lie, to deceive, to manipulate others just as he had been manipulated. The question that haunted him as he pulled his hood low against the evening's chill was whether he could master these dark arts without losing the very qualities that made him worth saving. The Game of Thrones demanded players willing to sacrifice everything for power, but Ned had already sacrificed his honor just to stay alive. Now he faced the even more challenging task of discovering who had saved him and why. While building the strength necessary to protect his family from the war his survival had failed to prevent. 2 weeks into his underground existence, Ned believed he had finally grasped the truth behind his miraculous rescue. The evidence seemed overwhelming, pointing toward a conspiracy that involved several key players but remained refreshingly straightforward in its ultimate goals. Like a man dying of thirst who discovers what appears to be fresh water, he drank deeply of this apparent understanding, grateful for clarity after days of confusion and uncertainty. The breakthrough came through a serving girl named Jenny, who worked in the Red Keep's kitchens and had developed a profitable sideline selling information to anyone willing to pay. She was young, perhaps 16, with the quick eyes and nervous energy of someone who had learned early that knowledge could be transformed into survival. Ned had been cultivating her trust for days, presenting himself as a merchant seeking gossip about the nobility's dining preferences. The fat spider and the mockingbird had words after the execution. Jennings whispered as she selected vegetables from a market stall, her voice barely audible above the vendors hawking. Heard them myself, when I brought wine to the small council chamber. Lord Varys was angry, said the plan had been too risky. Lord Baelish just laughed and said sometimes the greatest risks bring the greatest rewards. Ned's heart raced at this intelligence. Here was concrete evidence that both Varys and Littlefinger had been involved in his rescue. The pieces began falling into place with satisfying clarity. Varys, with his network of informants and access to official documents, could have arranged for the forged decree. Littlefinger, with his financial resources and connections throughout the city, could have coordinated the timing and bought the necessary cooperation from key gold cloaks. Further investigation seemed to confirm this theory. A wine merchant who supplied several Red Keep officials reported seeing Varys in deep conversation with men wearing Night's Watch blacks the day before the execution. A money changer in the Street of Silver mentioned unusual transactions involving accounts linked to Littlefinger's various business interests, large sums moving to unnamed recipients during the crucial period. The motive appeared equally clear. Both men were notorious for playing multiple sides in any conflict, positioning themselves to benefit regardless of the outcome. Ned's survival served their interests by creating chaos and uncertainty, conditions in which clever men could advance their positions while their betters focused on more obvious threats. Varys presumably wanted to maintain his role as the realm's spymaster regardless of who sat the Iron Throne. By saving Ned, he created a valuable asset who owed him an enormous debt, while simultaneously ensuring that the North's rebellion would continue and weaken the Lannisters. A grateful Ned Stark might prove more useful than a dead martyr in the complex calculations that guided the spider's web. Littlefinger's motivation seemed even clearer. His hatred for the nobility that had rejected him was well known, as was his particular resentment toward the Starks for Catelyn's marriage to Ned instead of himself. By saving Ned's life, he created a situation where his childhood rival would be forced to live as a hunted criminal, dependent on the very type of underhanded dealings that Petyr Baelish had mastered. More importantly, the ongoing war would provide countless opportunities for a man of Littlefinger's talents. Chaos created markets for information, weapons, supplies, and services that peaceful times could never generate. A prolonged conflict between North and South would make him rich while simultaneously weakening all the great houses that had once looked down on the minor lord from the Fingers. The more Ned considered this explanation, the more satisfying it became. It explained the sophisticated planning behind his rescue, the access to official seals and documents, the coordination with the Night's Watch, and the precise timing of the intervention. Both Varys and Littlefinger possessed the resources and motivation necessary for such an operation. Most importantly, this understanding provided Ned with a clear path forward. If Varys and Littlefinger were his secret benefactors, then he could potentially make contact with them directly. Rather than struggling alone in the shadows, he might be able to negotiate some form of ongoing assistance in exchange for future cooperation. The prospect of having powerful allies, even untrustworthy ones, offered hope after weeks of isolation and uncertainty. But even as Ned began planning his approach to these potential allies, subtle doubts gnawed at the edges of his newfound confidence. The serving girl's information seemed almost too convenient, her timing too perfect. She had approached him rather than the reverse, claiming to have overheard a conversation that perfectly confirmed his suspicions about the two most obvious suspects. Moreover, The financial evidence, while suggestive, remained circumstantial. Large sums of money moved through King's Landing daily, particularly during times of political uncertainty. The transactions Ned had identified could have been related to any number of activities, from legitimate business dealings to completely unrelated conspiracies. Most troubling was the behavior of Varys and Littlefinger themselves since the execution. Both men continued their normal routines, attending small council meetings and maintaining their usual patterns of activity. If they had just executed a dangerous rescue operation that defied the king's direct orders, wouldn't they show some signs of nervousness or unusual caution? Instead, both seemed remarkably calm and confident, as if Ned's survival posed no threat to their positions or safety. This could indicate supreme confidence in their planning and security measures, but it might also suggest that they had nothing to hide because they had not been involved in the first place. Ned found himself studying other potential explanations for his rescue, possibilities that the Varys and Littlefinger theory did not adequately address. The Night's Watch brothers who had participated in the operation moved with military precision that suggested professional training beyond what most Black brothers possessed. The forged decree bore not only the proper seals but also subtle details in the parchment and ink that indicated access to the crown's most secure supplies. Furthermore, the operation's timing required intelligence about Joffrey's plans that went beyond normal court gossip. Someone had known with certainty that the execution would proceed as scheduled, despite the chaos and uncertainty surrounding the transition from Robert's death to Joffrey's coronation. This level of inside knowledge suggested connections that reached into the very heart of Lannister power. These doubts crystallized during a chance encounter in the Sept of Baelor, where Ned had gone to observe the place of his near death and perhaps gain insight into his rescue. As he knelt among other worshippers maintaining his disguise as a simple tradesman seeking the Seven's blessing, he noticed a familiar figure several rows ahead. Sir Balin Payne, the king's executioner, knelt in apparent prayer, his gaunt face impassive as always. But something about his posture, the way he held his head, suggested tension rather than devotion. As Ned watched, Payne glanced repeatedly toward the spot where the execution block had stood, his expression unreadable but somehow troubled. The executioner's presence raised uncomfortable questions. If Varys and Littlefinger had orchestrated Ned's rescue, why would the man who had nearly killed him be praying in the same location? Was Payne's visit coincidence, guilt, or something else entirely? Did the mute knight know something about the rescue that others did not? As Ned left the Sept, his certainty about Varys and Littlefinger's involvement began to crumble like poorly mortared stone. The evidence that had seemed so convincing now appeared fragile and circumstantial. The serving girl's information could have been deliberately planted. The financial transactions might be red herrings designed to mislead investigators. The whole trail of clues could be an elaborate deception created by the true orchestrators of his rescue. This realization brought with it a deeper and more disturbing understanding. If his initial theory was wrong, if Varys and Littlefinger were not his secret benefactors, then someone else had gone to enormous trouble to make it appear that they were involved. This suggested a level of sophistication and forward-thinking that dwarfed anything he had previously encountered in King's Landing's political games. The implications chilled him more than the evening air as he made his way back to his hidden sanctuary. His rescue had not been the product of opportunistic scheming by known players. Instead, it represented the opening move in a game whose rules he did not understand, played by opponents whose identities remained hidden behind layers of misdirection and false evidence. As night fell over King's Landing, Ned stared through his small window at the Red Keep's distant towers and acknowledged a truth he had been avoiding. His survival was not the result of luck, friendship, or even calculated self-interest from familiar enemies. Someone had wanted him alive for reasons that went far beyond the immediate political situation, and they possessed resources and planning capabilities that suggested involvement from forces he had not yet identified or even imagined. The ancient tunnels beneath King's Landing held secrets that predated the Targaryen conquest by centuries, carved from living rock by forgotten kings and expanded by each successive dynasty. These passages formed a hidden city beneath the capital's streets. Here, in the suffocating darkness that even torchlight could barely penetrate, Ned Stark began to understand the true scope of the forces that had manipulated his fate. His guide through this subterranean maze was an unexpected ally. Brother Osric had introduced himself as a septon, serving in one of Flea Bottom's smaller septs, but his knowledge of the tunnel system and his network of contacts suggested a history far more complex than simple religious service. The man moved through the underground passages with the confidence of long familiarity, his weathered hands finding handholds in absolute darkness that would have left others stumbling blindly. These tunnels connect every major building in the city, Osric explained as they navigated a particularly narrow passage that seemed to run directly beneath the Street of Steel. The Red Keep, the Great Sept, the Dragon Pit ruins, even some of the larger brothels and taverns. Most people believe they were built for smuggling, but the truth runs much deeper. The Septon's torch cast dancing shadows on walls that bore carvings from multiple eras. Ned recognized Targaryen dragons intertwined with the seven-pointed stars of the faith, but other symbols defied easy identification. Ancient runes that might have been First Men markings shared space with geometric patterns that seemed almost Valyrian in their complexity. "Who built all this?" Ned asked, running his fingers across stone that felt older than Winterfell itself. "Many hands over many centuries," Osric replied cryptically, "but the most recent expansions were commissioned by someone who understood that knowledge is the truest form of power, someone who needed to move unseen through a city where every step was watched." Their destination proved to be a vast chamber deep beneath the hill of Rhaenys, where the ruins of the Dragon Pit cast long shadows in the world above. Here Ned discovered a gathering that challenged everything he thought he knew about King's Landing's hidden politics. Men and women from every level of society sat in carefully arranged circles, their conversations conducted in whispers that somehow carried clearly in the chamber's strange acoustics. He recognized faces from his weeks of careful observation. The blacksmith Topo Mott sat beside a woman Ned now knew to be one of Littlefinger's most trusted employees. A gold cloak captain he had identified as potentially sympathetic to Stark interests, shared quiet words with a servant from the Red Keep's kitchens. Most surprisingly, several individuals wearing the robes of septons and scepters mingled freely with others whose clothing marked them as merchants, craftsmen, and minor nobles. "Welcome to the true heart of King's Landing," Osric said, gesturing toward the assembled group. "Here gather those who serve something greater than any individual king or queen. We are the custodians of continuity, the guardians of knowledge that must survive, regardless of which banner flies over the Red Keep." The Septon's words carried weight that went beyond their immediate meaning. As Ned studied the faces around him, he began to recognize patterns that spoke of organization far more sophisticated than any simple conspiracy. These people represented every major institution in the capital, from the Faith and the Citadel to the various guilds and trading companies that kept the city functioning. An elderly woman approached their group, her maester's chain glinting in the torchlight despite her feminine features. Ned's surprise must have shown clearly on his face, because she smiled with genuine amusement before speaking. "I am Maester Qyburn's predecessor, in certain unofficial capacities," she said, her voice carrying the authority of long years in positions of real power. "My name is not important, but my purpose is, I serve the continuity of knowledge, ensuring that critical information survives the rise and fall of individual rulers." Her presence raised disturbing questions about the Citadel's true nature and influence. If women could achieve the rank of masters in secret, if there existed parallel structures within institutions that everyone believed they understood, then the game being played in Westeros was far more complex than even Tywin Lannister realized. Your rescue was necessary, the hidden maester continued, settling beside Ned on a stone bench that had been carved from the chamber's living rock. Not because of your individual importance, though that is considerable, but because your death at that particular moment would have disrupted carefully laid plans spanning decades. The revelation hit Ned like a physical blow. His survival had not been about saving his life, or protecting his family, or even preventing war. Instead, he was a game piece whose continued existence served purposes he could not yet comprehend, moved by players whose identities remained hidden behind layers of institutional authority. "What plans?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The woman's eyes, sharp despite her apparent age, studied him with the intensity of someone evaluating a potentially dangerous weapon. The realm faces threats that go far beyond the ambitions of any single house. Beyond the wall, ancient powers stir that have slept since the long night. Across the narrow sea, dragons have returned to a world that thought them extinct forever. In the east, shadows lengthen as old magics awaken to purposes we do not yet understand. Her words carried the weight of prophecy. But Ned had learned to be suspicious of grand pronouncements about destiny and ancient powers. And how does my survival serve to address these threats? Because, Osric interjected, you are one of the few men in Westeros who has the bloodline, the respect and the military experience necessary to forge the alliances that will be required. The Seven Kingdoms must stand united when the real war comes, and that unity cannot be achieved by boy kings who rule through fear, or queens who see every rival as an enemy to be destroyed. The implications of their words slowly became clear. This network, whatever its true nature and scope, was preparing for conflicts that would dwarf the current struggle between Stark and Lannister. They saw Ned not merely as a political figure or military commander, but as a potential unifying force who could rally the realm when faced with existential threats. But the most disturbing revelation came from an unexpected source. A young man wearing servant's clothing approached their group, his movements carrying the fluid grace that Ned had learned to associate with trained fighters. When he spoke, his accent carried traces of Braavos and the free cities beyond. "The faceless men send their regards, Lord Stark," the young man said, his words carefully neutral despite their shocking content. "Your survival serves purposes that align with our own interests, though our reasons may differ from those of our colleagues here." The revelation that the legendary assassins of Braavos were somehow involved in his rescue sent chills down Ned's spine. The faceless men were death incarnate, servants of the many-faced god who killed for coin and conviction with equal efficiency. Their involvement suggested levels of planning and resources that went far beyond anything he had previously imagined. The Game of Thrones is a children's squabble compared to the forces now stirring, the Braavosi continued. Ancient debts come due, old promises must be kept, and the wheel of history turns toward a reckoning that has been postponed for centuries. Your role in what comes next has been written in prophecy and paid for in blood. As the night wore on, Ned learned more about this hidden network than he had discovered in weeks of careful investigation above ground. The organization apparently had roots that stretched back to the Targaryen conquest, possibly even earlier. Its members included representatives from every major city in Westeros, with connections that extended across the narrow sea to the free cities and beyond. They called themselves the Custodians, though Ned suspected this was merely one name among many they had used over the centuries. Their purpose seemed to be the preservation of knowledge and the maintenance of certain bloodlines and institutions that they deemed essential to the realm's survival. They were not rulers or would-be rulers, but rather the hidden foundation upon which more visible powers built their temporary dominions. The most chilling aspect of their revelation was the matter-of-fact way they discussed manipulating events that Ned had believed to be the result of individual choices and random chance. Robert's death, Joffrey's coronation, even the timing of various lords' decisions to support or oppose the crown, all appeared to have been influenced by forces working toward goals that spanned generations rather than mere years. As dawn approached in the world above, Ned climbed back toward the surface, with his understanding of reality fundamentally altered. The Game of Thrones that had seemed so complex and dangerous now appeared to be merely the visible surface of currents that ran far deeper. His rescue had been orchestrated not by ambitious lords or cunning spy masters, but by an organization that viewed individual lives and even entire dynasties as temporary elements in a much larger pattern. The question that haunted him as he emerged into King's Landing's familiar streets was whether he could master this deeper game, or whether he was destined to remain a pawn moved by forces he could never fully understand or control. The revelation came through blood, as the most important truths often do in Westeros. 3 weeks after his introduction to the custodians, Ned found himself crouched in an abandoned cellar beneath a tanner's shop in Flea Bottom, staring at evidence that shattered his understanding of his own family's history. The documents spread before him on a rough wooden table were written in his father's hand, but they described secrets that Ned Stark had taken to his grave in the flames of King Aerys's wildfire. Brother Osric stood beside him, his septon's robes dusty from their journey through the tunnels that had brought them to this hidden archive. The man's face bore the gravity of someone who understood the magnitude of what he was revealing, the weight of knowledge that could reshape the political landscape of the Seven Kingdoms. Your father was not simply a lord who opposed the Mad King's tyranny, Osric began, his voice carefully controlled. Ned Stark was one of the founding members of what would eventually become the Custodians. His rebellion was not driven solely by the injustices committed against your brother Brandon or your sister Lyanna. It was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to remove a Targaryen king who had become too dangerous to the realm's survival. The documents before Ned told a story that contradicted everything he had been taught about Robert's rebellion. His father's letters, written in the months before his death, detailed communications with lords throughout Westeros who shared concerns that went far beyond Aerys's madness. They spoke of ancient bloodlines being corrupted, of magical forces being unleashed without proper understanding, of prophecies that pointed toward catastrophic consequences if certain Targaryen experiments were allowed to continue. Most shocking was a letter dated just weeks before the tournament at Harrenhal, where his father described a meeting with representatives from Old Town, Braavos, and even the distant Summer Isles. The gathering had apparently been convened to discuss intelligence about Aerys's increasing obsession with wildfire and his attempts to communicate with what the letter described as powers that should remain dormant until the appointed time. The Mad King was not simply insane, Osric explained as Ned struggled to process the implications. His madness was the result of exposure to forces that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. The wildfire he hoarded beneath King's Landing was not merely a weapon, it was a component in rituals designed to awaken things that had slept since the long night. Ned's hands trembled as he read his father's description of captured wildfire caches that contained more than simple alchemical fire. According to Rickard's investigations, some of the hidden stores had been infused with substances that defied natural law, materials that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. The pyromancers who created these enhanced versions had died horribly, their bodies found in conditions that suggested they had been consumed from within by the very forces they sought to harness. But the documents revealed an even more disturbing truth about the rebellion's true nature. The alliance between Stark, Baratheon, Arryn, and Tully had not been forged simply through shared outrage at Aerys's crimes. Instead, it represented the culmination of years of careful planning by the Custodians, who had identified the need to remove the Targaryen dynasty before their experiments could unleash catastrophe upon the realm. Robert was chosen not simply because of his strength or his claim through Targaryen blood. Osric continued. He was selected because his mind was too simple to be corrupted by the whispers that had driven Aerys to madness. A warrior king who thought in terms of wine, women, and warfare could not be tempted by promises of power that transcended mortal understanding. The implications of this revelation extended far beyond the rebellion itself. If Robert's kingship had been orchestrated by the custodians, then the events that followed, including Robert's gradual decline and eventual death, took on entirely different significance. Even the current crisis, with Joffrey's madness echoing his grandfather's instability, appeared to be part of patterns that had been recognized and planned for decades in advance. Ned found a letter that bore his own name, written in his father's hand but never sent. The contents revealed Rickard's intentions for his second son, plans that had been disrupted by Brandon's death, and the rapid escalation of events that led to open rebellion. According to the letter, Ned had been intended to serve as a bridge between the ancient traditions of the North and the evolving needs of the custodians' mission. "Your father saw in you qualities that your brother Brandon lacked," Osric explained. "Honor tempered by pragmatism, strength balanced by wisdom, loyalty that could extend beyond family to encompass the realm itself. He believed you could carry forward the work that his death would interrupt." The weight of inherited responsibility settled on Ned's shoulders like a cloak woven from obligation and dread. Everything he had believed about his father's motivations, about his own role in the realm's affairs, about the very nature of the conflicts that had shaped his life, had been built upon incomplete information. The truth was far more complex and terrifying than simple political ambition or personal honor. But the documents contained one more revelation that struck Ned like a physical blow. Hidden within a cipher that took Osric considerable time to decode was information about Lyanna's fate that contradicted the official story of her death at the Tower of Joy. According to Rickard's final communications, received through channels that had somehow survived even after his death, Lyanna had not been simply kidnapped by Rhaegar Targaryen. "Your sister volunteered for a mission that she knew would likely cost her life," Osric said gently, recognizing the pain that this knowledge brought. Rhaegar had discovered something in his studies of prophecy, something that convinced him that only through a union of ice and fire could the realm be prepared for the darkness that was coming. Lyanna understood the stakes and chose to play her part, even knowing the cost. The revelation that his sister had been a willing participant in events that the realm interpreted as abduction and rape fundamentally altered Ned's understanding of everything that had followed. Robert's rage, his own guilt over failing to protect her, the entire emotional foundation of the rebellion had been based on a lie that Lyanna herself had helped to create. More disturbing still was the implication that Jon Snow, the bastard he had raised as his own son, might carry bloodlines that made him significant to the same forces that had manipulated the Targaryen dynasty. The boy's parentage, which Ned had guarded as a secret that could destroy his honor and marriage, apparently had implications that stretched far beyond personal shame or political inconvenience. "The child lives," Osric stated with certainty that suggested direct knowledge, "and his existence represents hope for the realm's survival when the real war begins. Your father's sacrifice, your sister's sacrifice, your own current situation, all have been necessary to preserve that hope." As Ned absorbed these revelations, he began to understand the true reason for his rescue from Joffrey's executioner. The custodians had not saved him out of sentiment or political calculation. They needed him alive because his role in the coming conflicts had been predetermined by forces that operated on timescales measured in centuries rather than years. The documents before him contained detailed predictions about the threats the realm would face, prophecies that had guided the custodians' planning for generations. Dragons returning to the world, ancient powers awakening beyond the wall, the rise of religious movements that would reshape the social order, all had been foreseen and prepared for through careful manipulation of bloodlines, institutions, and political structures. Your survival ensures that when the time comes, there will be someone with the authority and respect necessary to unite the fractured kingdom, Osric explained. The North remembers, but it will need leadership that can bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and present necessity. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these revelations was the understanding that the current conflicts between the great houses were merely preparations for something far worse. The War of Five Kings, devastating as it promised to be, would serve to identify and eliminate leaders who lacked the strength or wisdom necessary for the real battles ahead. Those who survived would be tested and tempered by fire, made ready for conflicts that would determine whether humanity itself would endure. As dawn broke over King's Landing, Ned climbed back toward the surface with his worldview fundamentally transformed. He was not simply a lord trying to survive in a hostile court, or a father seeking to protect his children from political machinations. He was the inheritor of a mission that had cost his father's life and his sister's happiness, a participant in a game whose stakes were measured not in crowns or castles, but in the survival of everything he held dear. The knowledge brought with it a terrible burden. He could no longer see the conflicts around him as simple struggles for power or revenge. Every death in the coming war, every family destroyed by the chaos that his supposed execution had helped to unleash, would be partially his responsibility. The price of understanding the true nature of the game was the realization that innocent blood would be shed to serve purposes that transcended individual lives or happiness. Yet with the burden came a kind of terrible clarity. His survival had meaning beyond his own desires or his family's immediate needs. The honor that had once seemed like an abstract principle now became a practical necessity, a foundation upon which the realm's future survival would be built. The truth about the forces orchestrating events across Westeros emerged like a vast web revealed by morning dew, each strand glistening with connections that had remained invisible until the proper light illuminated their existence. 4 weeks after learning about his father's involvement with the custodians, Ned found himself in the deepest chambers beneath King's Landing, face to face with individuals whose influence stretched across continents and whose planning encompassed centuries. The chamber itself defied architectural logic, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow torchlight before it could penetrate their depths. Ancient columns supported arches carved with symbols that predated any known civilization in Westeros, while the floor bore inlays of precious metals that formed patterns suggesting star charts or magical formulae too complex for casual interpretation. Around a table made from a single piece of weirwood, pale as bone and marked with what appeared to be faces carved by no human hand, sat 7 figures whose presence explained decades of seemingly unrelated events. Ned recognized none of them, yet their bearing and the deference shown by Brother Osric suggested importance that went far beyond conventional political power. The woman who appeared to be their leader wore robes that shifted color in the flickering light, sometimes appearing deep blue like a night sky, other times showing silver patterns that moved like living things across the fabric. Her age was impossible to determine, her features suggesting anything from 30 to 300 years, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very stones around them. "We are the descendants of those who served the last of the Dragon Lords," she began, her words measured and precise. "Not Valyrians themselves, but the servants and scholars who preserved their knowledge when the 14 flames consumed their civilization. For centuries, we have guided the affairs of the known world, ensuring that certain bloodlines survived, that crucial knowledge was preserved, that the mistakes of old Valyria were not repeated." Her revelation recontextualized everything. Ned thought he understood about Westerosi history. The Targaryen conquest had not been a simple act of ambition by the last dragon riders, but rather a carefully orchestrated relocation designed to establish a new center of power, safely distant from whatever catastrophe had destroyed Valyria. The Iron Throne itself was never meant to be an end goal, but rather a tool for maintaining stability while greater preparations took place. A second figure, this one wearing the simple brown robes of a maester but bearing a chain that incorporated metals Ned could not identify, continued the explanation. The Citadel, the Faith, the Iron Bank of Bravos, even the Faceless Men, all trace their origins to institutions we established or influenced. Each serves a piece of the greater purpose, though few within these organizations understand their true significance. The scope of the conspiracy became clear as the seven figures revealed the extent of their involvement in recent events. The War of the Usurper had been encouraged not to remove a mad king, but to prevent him from completing rituals that would have awakened powers dormant since Valyria's fall. Robert's reign was maintained to provide stability while they moved other pieces into position. Even his death had been timed to coincide with the return of conditions they had been waiting centuries to see again. "Dragons have returned to the world," the first woman announced, her words carrying weight that suggested direct knowledge rather than speculation. Across the narrow sea, a girl who carries the blood of old Valyria has awakened creatures that most believed extinct forever. But she lacks the knowledge to control what she has unleashed, just as her ancestors lacked the wisdom to prevent their civilization's destruction. The implications sent chills through Ned's understanding of current events. Daenerys Targaryen's survival and apparent success in the lands beyond the Free Cities were not accidents of fate or demonstrations of individual strength. They were the results of careful manipulation by forces that had been guiding her path since birth, preparing her for a role she could not yet comprehend. But the dragons represented only one aspect of the gathering storm. A third figure, whose features seemed to shift and change like those of the Faceless Men, spoke of developments beyond the wall that confirmed Ned's worst fears about ancient threats awakening. The Night's Watch had sent ravens bearing reports that their organization had dismissed as the fantasies of men driven mad by isolation and cold, but which the seven figures interpreted as signs that their greatest enemy was finally stirring. The others were not defeated in the long night, the shape-shifting figure explained. They were merely forced into a slumber that would last until conditions aligned properly for their return. The gradual warming that has characterized recent decades was not natural climate variation, but the result of their increasing influence as the barriers that contained them slowly weakened. The revelation that the changing seasons themselves were symptoms of supernatural forces preparing for war transformed Ned's understanding of the realm's situation. The conflicts between the great houses, devastating as they promised to be, were merely preliminary skirmishes before a war that would determine whether humanity survived at all. Every lord who died fighting for crowns and castles was one fewer potential defender when the real enemy finally revealed itself. A fourth figure, wearing robes that seemed to be woven from shadow itself, provided the most disturbing intelligence of all. The network of prophecies that had guided the custodians' planning for centuries was beginning to converge, pointing toward a period of crisis that would either see humanity ascend to new heights of power and knowledge or face complete extinction. The prince that was promised, Azor Ahai reborn, the last hero. All the prophecies speak of the same individual, the shadow figure intoned. But they also warn that the chosen one may emerge from bloodlines that most would never suspect. The bastard you raised as your own son carries genes that make him significant beyond your understanding, Lord Stark. The confirmation of Jon's importance struck Ned like a physical blow. The boy he had protected through years of shame and political inconvenience was apparently central to plans that spanned centuries. Every sacrifice Ned had made to preserve the secret of Jon's parentage had been necessary not just to protect a child from Robert's wrath, but to ensure the survival of humanity's potential savior. But the seven figures revealed that Jon was not their only concern. Across Westeros, individuals carrying crucial bloodlines were being identified and protected, their paths carefully guided toward eventual convergence. Some, like Daenerys Targaryen, moved openly with dragons and armies. Others, like the bastards and outcasts scattered throughout the realm, remained hidden until their time came to step forward. Your own daughters represent possibilities we cannot ignore, the first woman continued. Sansa carries the diplomatic skills and noble bearing that could unite fractured kingdoms under a single banner. Arya possesses abilities that have attracted attention from the faceless men themselves, suggesting potential we are only beginning to understand. The realization that his children were also game pieces in this vast conspiracy filled Ned with rage and despair in equal measure. Everything he had tried to protect them from, every sacrifice he had made to preserve their innocence, had been rendered meaningless by forces that viewed even his fatherly love as a tool to be manipulated for greater purposes. Yet as the night wore on and more revelations emerged, Ned began to understand the terrible logic that drove these ancient planners. The threats facing the realm were so vast and catastrophic that conventional approaches to leadership and warfare would prove utterly inadequate. Only by identifying and preparing individuals who combined the right bloodlines, training, and circumstances could humanity hope to survive what was coming. The most chilling aspect of their planning was its scope and patience. Marriages had been arranged across centuries to preserve and combine crucial genetic traits. Wars had been encouraged or prevented based on their impact on population distributions and resource allocation. Even religions had been influenced to prepare humanity psychologically for conflicts that would challenge every assumption about the nature of reality itself. "We saved your life, Lord Stark, because your role in what comes next has been written in prophecy and purchased with blood," the first woman concluded. "You will be the bridge between the old ways and the new, the leader who helps others understand that survival requires abandoning comfortable lies in favor of terrible truths." As dawn approached in the world above, Ned climbed back toward the surface, with the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer simply a lord trying to protect his family or a survivor seeking revenge against those who had wronged him. He was a chosen instrument of forces that operated on scales beyond human comprehension, tasked with preparing the realm for a war that would determine whether his species continued to exist. The knowledge brought clarity, but no comfort. Every decision he made from this moment forward would ripple through time in ways he could not fully predict or control. The honor that had once guided his choices now became a burden that must be balanced against necessities that would have horrified the young man who had learned justice at his father's knee. Yet perhaps most disturbing of all was the understanding that even this revelation might not represent the full truth. If forces this ancient and powerful had been manipulating events for centuries, how could he be certain that his current understanding was any more complete than his previous ignorance? The Game of Thrones had revealed itself to be merely the surface layer of conflicts that stretched back to the very foundations of civilization itself. The transformation of enemies into allies began with blood spilled in a Flea Bottom alley, where Ned discovered that survival sometimes required abandoning every principle that had once defined his character. The attack came without warning as he made his way back from another clandestine meeting with the custodians, three sellswords emerging from shadows with steel already drawn and murder gleaming in their eyes. His weeks as a hunted man had sharpened reflexes that years of comfortable lordship had dulled, but the assailants moved with professional competence that spoke of significant payment for his death. The first blade nearly opened his throat before instinct threw him sideways into a doorway that provided momentary cover from the coordinated assault. The rescue came from the last source he would have expected. Tyrion Lannister stepped from a wine shop across the narrow street, crossbow in hand and murder in his mismatched eyes, as he put bolts through two of the attackers with precision that would have impressed his brother Jaime. The third sellsword died on ice, Ned's ancestral blade somehow appearing in his grip, despite weeks of believing it lost when Joffrey seized his possessions. "Well, Lord Stark," Tyrion said, with the sardonic smile that had irritated Ned during their previous encounters. "It seems we have much to discuss. Shall we adjourn to somewhere more private before the City Watch arrives to investigate these unfortunate deaths?" The dwarf's intervention raised questions that multiplied with each step they took through King's Landing's twisting streets. Tyrion led them not to one of his usual haunts, but to a modest building near the docks where the smell of salt air mingled with less pleasant odors from the harbor. Inside, Ned found himself in surroundings that suggested this meeting had been planned well in advance. "Your surprise is understandable," Tyrion acknowledged, settling into a chair that had been positioned to accommodate his stature while keeping clear sightlines to all entrances. "The last time we met, I was your prisoner, and you were preparing to tear my family apart through legal proceedings. Circumstances change perspectives in remarkable ways." The dwarf poured wine from a bottle that bore no maker's mark, his movements careful and deliberate as he explained the developments that had led to this unexpected alliance. His own investigation into Joffrey's increasingly erratic behavior had revealed connections that forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about recent events in King's Landing. "My dear nephew has been receiving visitors," Tyrion continued, his voice dropping to levels that barely carried across the small room. "Men wearing the robes of septons but carrying themselves like soldiers, women claiming to serve the faith, but speaking with accents that suggest origins far from Westeros. They meet with him in chambers that my family's spies cannot penetrate, and afterward Joffrey's commands become even more bizarre and destructive." The revelation that outside forces were influencing the boy king provided a partial explanation for the escalating chaos that had consumed the capital since Robert's death. Joffrey's natural cruelty, always kept in check by his mother's political instincts, had been weaponized by advisors whose goals went far beyond simple power or revenge. "I began investigating these mysterious counselors," Tyrion explained, "and discovered that they were asking questions about you, Lord Stark. Not about your location or your activities since the execution, but about your bloodline, your connections to the North's ancient families, your relationships with houses that trace their ancestry back to the First Men." This intelligence confirmed suspicions that had been growing in Ned's mind since his conversations with the custodians. His survival had attracted attention from multiple factions, each with their own interpretation of his significance and their own plans for how he might serve their purposes. The boy king's handlers apparently viewed him as a threat that needed to be eliminated before he could fulfill whatever destiny they feared he represented. But Tyrion's assistance came with complications that went beyond simple gratitude. The dwarf's own investigations had uncovered evidence of financial irregularities that suggested someone with vast resources was systematically destabilizing the realm's economy. Gold was being moved in patterns that made no sense from a traditional business perspective, but which would be logical if the goal was to create conditions favorable for radical political change. "The Iron Bank of Bravos has called in debts that the crown cannot pay," Tyrion revealed, his expression growing grim. "But more disturbing is evidence that they are also extending credit to lords who would normally never qualify for such loans. It appears they are deliberately creating conditions that will force a restructuring of power throughout Westeros." The dwarf's intelligence painted a picture of manipulation that extended far beyond the custodians' admitted involvement in recent events. Multiple organizations with competing agendas were moving pieces on the same board, their activities creating a complexity that threatened to spiral beyond anyone's ability to control or predict. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another unexpected ally. Ser Jorah Mormont entered through a door that Ned had not noticed, the Northern Knight's weathered face bearing the marks of recent travel and considerable hardship. His presence raised immediate questions about how he had located their meeting and what news he brought from across the narrow sea. "Lord Stark," Jorah said, inclining his head with the respect due to a liege lord, despite the years that had passed since his exile from the north. I bring word from Daenerys Targaryen, though the message is not what you might expect from a claimant to the Iron Throne." The knight's words carried weight that went beyond their immediate content. His loyalty to the Targaryen girl was well known, making his presence in King's Landing a development that suggested significant changes in the political landscape beyond Westeros. But his message proved even more surprising than his appearance. "The Mother of Dragons sends greetings to the man she calls the Last Wolf," Jorah continued, using a title that Ned had never heard applied to himself. "She has learned of your survival through sources that she describes as more reliable than her own advisors, and she offers alliance against enemies that threaten both your causes." The proposal of cooperation between the last Stark Lord and the last Targaryen princess would have seemed impossible weeks earlier, but Ned's expanded understanding of the forces moving through Westeros made such alliances not only possible but necessary. If ancient powers were indeed stirring, if the realm faced threats that transcended traditional political boundaries, then old enemies would need to become new allies. Jorah's intelligence about Daenerys' situation provided crucial context for understanding the broader pattern of events. Her dragons, while magnificent and terrifying, were still young and difficult to control. More importantly, her advisors included individuals whose true loyalties remained questionable, men whose counsel seemed designed to guide her toward actions that served agendas she did not fully understand. "She has been warned about the manipulations surrounding her," Jorah explained, "and she seeks allies who value truth over convenience. The messages I carry speak of shared enemies and common purposes that go beyond any individual claim to thrones or crowns." But perhaps the most significant alliance offered came from a source that challenged every assumption Ned had made about religious movements within the realm. The High Sparrow himself, through intermediaries whose identities remained carefully concealed, had extended overtures that suggested the faith militants' rise was not simply a reaction to noble corruption and royal excess. "The most devout have received revelations," Tyrion reported, his tone suggesting skepticism about divine inspiration while acknowledging its political significance. "Visions that speak of darkness rising and the need for unity among those who would defend the realm against forces that serve neither the Seven nor any earthly power." The religious leaders' interest in forming connections with surviving members of ancient bloodlines suggested an understanding that went beyond conventional theological concerns. The faith's recent militarization and its growing influence among the common folk apparently served purposes that aligned with the custodians' preparations for coming conflicts. As the night progressed, Ned found himself at the center of a web of alliances that would have been unthinkable during his time as Hand of the King. Tyrion Lannister, whose family had become his sworn enemies, now offered intelligence and resources in exchange for cooperation against shared threats. Jorah Mormont brought proposals from a Targaryen claimant who should have been his mortal enemy but instead sought partnership against forces that threatened them both. Most remarkably, representatives of the faith offered spiritual and material support based on prophecies that identified him as crucial to the realm's survival. The movement that had once seemed like simple religious revival now revealed itself as another aspect of the preparations that had been taking place throughout Westeros for generations. The convergence of these unlikely allies around his person confirmed what the custodians had told him about his role in coming events. He was becoming a focal point for resistance against forces that operated beyond conventional political understanding, a rallying point for those who recognized that the realm's survival required cooperation that transcended traditional loyalties and ancient grudges. Yet even as these alliances formed, Ned remained conscious of the delicate balance required to maintain them. Each ally brought their own agenda and their own interpretation of what cooperation should entail. Managing these relationships while preserving his own principles and protecting his family would require diplomatic skills that his reputation for blunt honesty had never suggested he possessed. The raven that arrived at Riverrun carried news that would transform the nature of warfare across Westeros more completely than any victory on the battlefield could have achieved. Catelyn Stark's hands trembled as she broke the seal and read words that resurrected hope she had believed, buried forever with her husband's supposed death. The message bore her husband's own hand, unmistakable, despite the weeks that had passed since she had last seen his careful script. "My beloved cat," the letter began, using the intimate name that only Ned had ever called her. "I live, though the realm believes otherwise. The game that nearly claimed my life continues, but I have learned its rules and found allies in places I never expected. Come south with all haste, but trust no one completely until we speak face to face. The dangers we face go beyond anything we imagined when I first rode to King's Landing." The transformation of grief into fierce determination spread through Riverrun like fire through dry grass. Edmure Tully, who had called his banners more from family duty than personal conviction, now found himself commanding lords whose enthusiasm for war had been rekindled by the prospect of fighting alongside rather than avenging the legendary Wolf of Winterfell. "The Starks endure" became the rallying cry that echoed from the battlements of every castle loyal to House Tully, where before the River Lords had prepared for a defensive war that promised only death and destruction in service of a hopeless cause. They now mobilized for a campaign that offered the possibility of actual victory against their enemies. The intelligence networks that had carried news of Ned's survival worked with efficiency that astonished even those who had helped establish them. Within days of his reappearance in King's Landing, coded messages reached lords throughout the Seven Kingdoms, each tailored to its recipient's specific situation and needs. The careful coordination suggested planning that went far beyond opportunistic messaging, revealing the existence of communication systems that had been developed over years rather than improvised in response to immediate circumstances. At Storm's End, Renly Baratheon received word of Ned's survival while entertaining lords whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of advancement and preferment rather than earned through shared ideals or mutual respect. The younger Baratheon brothers' natural charisma had attracted supporters who sought easy paths to power, but Ned's return complicated every calculation upon which their allegiance depended. "If Stark lives," Lord Randyll Tarly observed with the blunt practicality that had made him one of the realm's most respected military commanders, "then our cause loses much of its moral authority. Men follow you because they believe you offer better leadership than the boy king, but they will not easily stand against a man whose honor is legendary throughout Westeros." The erosion of support that began immediately after news of Ned's survival reached Renly's camp demonstrated the fragile nature of alliances built upon personal ambition rather than deeper principles. Lords who had pledged their swords to the charismatic young Baratheon began finding excuses to delay their commitments or withdraw their forces entirely, claiming urgent business in their own lands that required immediate attention. But perhaps the most dramatic shift occurred in the mind of Stannis Baratheon, whose rigid sense of justice had been offended by his brother Robert's failures and his nephew Joffrey's obvious illegitimacy. The news that Ned Stark lived transformed Stannis' rebellion from a lonely crusade for legal legitimacy into a cause that commanded respect throughout the realm. "The hand of the king bears witness to the truth I have proclaimed," Stannis declared to his assembled lords on Dragonstone, his voice carrying conviction that had been absent during his previous attempts to rally support. "Eddard Stark's honor is unquestioned, his knowledge of the royal court unmatched. When he testifies that Joffrey is no true king, none will be able to deny the validity of my claim." The practical implications of these revelations forced every major player in the Game of Thrones to reconsider strategies that had been months in the making. Armies that had been positioned for specific battles found themselves needing to adapt to completely different strategic situations, while lords who had committed their resources based on particular assumptions about their enemies' capabilities discovered that the fundamental nature of the conflict had changed. In the north, Robb Stark's War Council underwent a transformation that reflected the broader changes sweeping through the realm. The young king in the north had been preparing for a campaign of vengeance that would satisfy his bannermen's desire for blood, while knowing that ultimate victory was probably impossible against the combined resources of the southern kingdoms. "We are no longer rebels fighting against the Iron Throne," Robb announced to his assembled lords, his voice carrying authority that his youth had previously made difficult to project. "We are loyalists fighting to restore legitimate rule and defend the realm against threats that go beyond conventional politics. This changes everything about how we conduct the war." The shift from rebellion to restoration provided the Northern Lords with justification for tactics and alliances that would have been unthinkable under their previous circumstances. Houses that had remained neutral could now be approached as potential allies rather than enemies to be conquered. Resources that had been hoarded for defensive purposes could be committed to offensive operations that served broader strategic goals. Most importantly, the change in the war's fundamental nature opened possibilities for cooperation with forces that had previously been considered irreconcilable enemies. Messages began flowing between northern commanders and representatives of houses that had been preparing to fight against them, exploring terms for truces or even active alliance against common foes. The ripple effects of these revelations reached beyond Westeros itself, affecting the calculations of powers across the Narrow Sea, who had been watching the developing civil war with interest but limited direct involvement. The Iron Bank of Braavos, whose loans to various factions had been designed to profit from prolonged conflict regardless of its ultimate outcome, found their carefully balanced investments threatened by the prospect of rapid resolution. In the free cities, merchant princes who had been preparing to exploit the economic opportunities created by Westerosi chaos discovered that their assumptions about the conflict's duration and intensity required fundamental revision. Trade agreements that had seemed profitable based on projections of sustained warfare now appeared risky as the possibility of unified Westerosi power re-emerged. Even more significantly, Daenerys Targaryen's advisors in Essos found themselves forced to reconsider their timeline for the young queen's eventual return to Westeros. The Targaryen restoration that had seemed like a distant possibility requiring years of preparation suddenly became a more immediate concern as the political landscape of her intended target underwent rapid transformation. If the usurper's regime collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, Ser Jorah Mormont observed during one of their planning sessions, then your grace may find opportunities to return home sooner than we anticipated. But success will require different strategies than we have been developing. The intelligence that reached Daenerys about Ned's survival included assessments of his character and capabilities that painted him as a potential ally rather than an inevitable enemy. The honor that had made him unsuitable for the previous Game of Thrones might prove to be exactly the quality needed for the challenges that lay ahead. Back in King's Landing, the immediate crisis created by Ned's reappearance forced rapid decisions from a royal court that had grown accustomed to the luxury of time for deliberation and planning. Queen Cersei's initial impulse toward immediate violence was restrained by advisors who understood that martyring the Lord of Winterfell would unite the entire realm against the Iron Throne. "The man commands respect that we cannot simply eliminate through force," Lord Tywin observed during an emergency session of the Small Council. "His death now would serve our enemies better than his continued existence serves us. We must find other means of neutralizing the threat he represents." The solution that emerged reflected input from the mysterious counselors who had been guiding royal policy since Joffrey's coronation. Rather than attempting to silence Ned through execution or imprisonment, they would provide him with a platform to speak while ensuring that his words could be discredited or reinterpreted to serve their own purposes. "Let him have his moment before the assembled lords," one of these shadowy advisors suggested. "Give him rope to hang himself with his own words. The truth he thinks he possesses may prove less damaging than the lies his enemies can construct from his testimony." The decision to allow Ned a public hearing represented a calculated risk that reflected confidence in their ability to control narratives and shape perceptions regardless of factual evidence. The manipulation of truth had become so sophisticated that they believed even the most honest testimony could be twisted to serve their agenda. But as preparations began for what would become known as the Great Trial, few of the participants understood that they were arranging a stage for revelations that would go far beyond questions of legitimacy and succession. The forces that had orchestrated Ned's survival had purposes that transcended the immediate political crisis, and his testimony would serve goals that none of the conventional players in the Game of Thrones had yet comprehended. The whisper that had begun with his rescue from Joffrey's executioner was about to become a roar that would be heard across the known world, transforming not just the nature of Westerosi politics, but the very foundations upon which human civilization had been built. The Great Trial that was meant to settle the question of legitimacy in Westeros instead became the stage for revelations that shattered every assumption the assembled lords held about the nature of reality itself. In the throne room of the Red Keep, with hundreds of nobles bearing witness and thousands more gathered in the courtyards beyond, Ned Stark spoke truths that transformed political conflict into something approaching holy war. Standing before the Iron Throne with chains still marking his wrists, but dignity restored to his bearing, Ned began not with accusations against the Lannisters or claims about Joffrey's parentage, but with testimony about forces that made such earthly concerns seem trivial by comparison. His words carried the weight of a man who had looked beyond the veil of conventional politics and seen the darkness gathering just beyond the edge of human perception. "My lords," he began, his voice echoing through stone halls that had heard countless speeches about power and justice, "I stand before you not as a man seeking vengeance for personal wrongs, but as a witness to truths that will determine whether any of us live to see another spring. The Game of Thrones that has consumed our attention and our blood is but a shadow play performed while real darkness gathers strength beyond our borders." The assembled nobility stirred uneasily at words that seemed to promise revelations beyond the simple questions of inheritance and legitimacy they had come to hear resolved. King Joffrey, seated on the throne with crown askew and irritation plain on his young features, gestured impatiently for Ned to continue with what he clearly expected to be conventional accusations and pleas for mercy. Instead, Ned spoke of the intelligence he had gathered during his weeks in hiding, painting a picture of coordinated threats that stretched from the lands beyond the Wall to the slave cities across the narrow sea. His testimony wove together reports from Night's Watch ravens, intelligence gathered by the custodian's agents, and prophecies preserved in texts that most scholars dismissed as fantasy. "The others stir in the true north," Ned declared, his words causing a ripple of nervous laughter among lords who considered such tales to be children's stories. "The barriers that contained them during the long night weaken with each passing season, and their servants have already begun moving south of the Wall. Rangers of the Night's Watch have encountered creatures that should not exist, witnessed phenomena that defy natural law." The laughter died as Ned produced evidence that even the most skeptical could not dismiss. Weapons recovered from beyond the Wall, forged from materials that remained cold to the touch despite the warmth of the throne room. Fragments of correspondence from maesters at Castle Black, their usual clinical language struggling to describe encounters that challenged their understanding of the possible. But perhaps most convincing were the testimonies of men who had served at the Wall and could speak from direct experience about the changes occurring in the far north. Lord Commander Mormont himself had sent sworn brothers south with instructions to bear witness before the assembled lords, their words carrying authority that court rumors could never match. "I have seen the dead walk," testified Sir Jeremy Riker, a knight whose service record was known to many in the assembled crowd. "I have watched corpses rise and fight with strength that no living man possesses. The enemy that destroyed the realm once before has returned, and we squabble over crowns while it gathers strength for war." The revelations about supernatural threats were disturbing enough, but Ned's testimony took an even more dramatic turn when he began connecting these developments to events occurring across the Narrow Sea. The return of dragons to the world, he argued, was not coincidence, but rather another symptom of fundamental changes in the magical forces that shaped reality. Daenerys Targaryen hatches dragons in the same season that the dead begin walking beyond the wall, Ned observed, his words carrying implications that few in the audience fully grasped. Ancient powers that have slept for centuries awaken simultaneously, suggesting patterns that go beyond mere chance. The realm faces a convergence of forces that our ancestors barely survived once before. The connection between disparate supernatural phenomena painted a picture of reality that challenged every assumption the assembled lords held about the nature of power and politics. If magic was returning to the world, if ancient enemies were stirring, then the skills and resources that had made them successful in conventional conflicts might prove utterly inadequate for what was coming. Joffrey's patience finally snapped as Ned's testimony moved further from the personal grievances the boy king had expected to hear. "Enough of this madness," he shouted, his voice cracking with adolescent fury. "You speak of monsters and magic like some mad septon preaching doom in the streets. We are here to determine your crimes, not listen to tales meant to frighten children." But the interruption provided Ned with the opening he had been waiting for, the moment when he could connect the supernatural threats he had described to the very real corruption that had brought the realm to its current crisis. His voice grew stronger as he began weaving together the various threads of his testimony into a pattern that revealed the true scope of the dangers they faced. "The corruption in King's Landing is not separate from these greater threats, Your Grace," Ned replied, his formal address carrying irony that was not lost on the assembled crowd. "It is a symptom of the same disease that allows ancient evils to gain strength. When honor dies, when truth becomes negotiable, when power serves only itself, the barriers that protected our ancestors begin to crumble." The accusation struck at the heart of everything the Lannister regime represented, but it went beyond simple political criticism to suggest that their rule was actively contributing to existential threats facing all humanity. The implications were staggering for lords who had supported Joffrey's claim based on calculations of personal advantage rather than questions of legitimacy or competence. Ned's final revelation proved the most shocking of all, as he began naming names and revealing connections that demonstrated how various factions had been manipulating events toward their own ends while remaining blind to the greater dangers their schemes were unleashing. The Custodians, the Iron Bank, the Faceless Men, and other organizations whose very existence was news to most of the assembled lords, all had been pursuing agendas that treated the current political crisis as merely one move in games that spanned centuries. "We have been pieces on a board whose boundaries we never understood," Ned declared, his words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "While we fought over castles and crowns, forces beyond our comprehension have been preparing for a war that will determine whether humanity itself survives. The time for such games has ended. We must choose now whether to stand together against the darkness or fall separately while arguing over the shadows." The silence that followed his testimony stretched long enough for the implications to sink into minds that had never been forced to consider threats beyond the conventional boundaries of political conflict. Some lords shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the truth in his words, while others maintained expressions of skepticism that barely concealed growing unease about developments they had previously ignored. The moment was broken by an interruption that none had anticipated. Maester Qyburn, the disgraced scholar who served as one of Cersei's advisors, stepped forward with documents that he claimed would refute Ned's testimony and expose it as elaborate fiction designed to excuse treason and rebellion. "My lords," Qyburn announced, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who believed he held decisive evidence, "I can prove that these tales of supernatural threats are fabrications, lies spread by enemies of the realm to distract us from their treasonous activities. The evidence speaks for itself. But as Qyburn began reading from his prepared documents, it became clear that his information had been carefully crafted to discredit specific aspects of Ned's testimony, while ignoring the broader patterns that made denial increasingly difficult to maintain. The Maester's refutations addressed details and individual claims rather than the overwhelming weight of evidence that pointed toward coordinated supernatural activity. More disturbing was the realization that Qyburn's counter-evidence had been prepared in advance, suggesting that someone had anticipated exactly what Ned would reveal and had taken steps to undermine its credibility. The speed and specificity of the response implied intelligence networks and planning capabilities that went far beyond what even the most paranoid lords had suspected. As the day wore on and testimony continued from various witnesses, a pattern emerged that revealed the true purpose behind the great trial. Rather than settling questions of legitimacy or determining individual guilt, the proceedings were serving as a forum where different factions could reveal their capabilities and test their influence over the assembled lords. The supernatural threats that Ned had described provided a backdrop against which every political calculation had to be re-evaluated, but the various responses to his testimony revealed as much about the responders as about the truth of his claims. Some lords began making discreet inquiries about the possibility of changing their allegiances, while others doubled down on their existing commitments out of stubbornness or fear of appearing weak. By evening, as torches were lit throughout the Red Keep and the formal proceedings drew to a close, it had become clear that the great trial had accomplished something entirely different from what any of its architects had intended. Instead of resolving the political crisis that had brought the realm to the brink of civil war, it had revealed the existence of threats and conspiracies that made such conflicts seem like elaborate distractions from the real business of survival. The whisper that had begun with Ned's survival in the Great Sept of Baelor had indeed grown into a storm, but not the kind of political tempest that anyone had anticipated. The forces of change unleashed by his testimony would reshape not just the immediate conflict between competing claimants, but the very foundations upon which Westerosi civilization had been built. The dawn that followed the great trial brought with it a transformation of allegiances that reshaped the political landscape of Westeros more thoroughly than any military victory could have accomplished. In the grey light filtering through the Red Keep's ancient windows, ravens flew to every corner of the realm carrying messages that would either unite the Seven Kingdoms against common threats or fragment them beyond any possibility of recovery. Ned stood in the chamber that had once served as his solar during his brief tenure as Hand of the King. But the man who gazed out at King's Landing bore little resemblance to the honorable fool who had first arrived in the capital months earlier. His survival had cost him illusions about the nature of power and politics, but it had given him something far more valuable in return. He now understood the true scope of the game being played and his own crucial role in determining its outcome. The alliance that began forming around his testimony started with the most unlikely of partnerships. Lord Tywin Lannister, the man whose family had become Ned's sworn enemies, requested a private meeting that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The old lion's legendary pride had been forced to yield to the practical recognition that certain threats transcended even the most bitter personal feuds. "Your words yesterday changed the nature of the game, Stark," Tywin said, without preamble, his voice carrying none of the warmth, but all of the respect that one master strategist might show another. "If half of what you claim proves true, then our previous conflicts become irrelevant luxury that the realm can no longer afford." The meeting between the two patriarchs took place in neutral ground, a sept chosen for its symbolic value as much as its security. Here, surrounded by representations of gods who supposedly valued justice and mercy, they negotiated terms that would preserve both their families while acknowledging the greater necessities imposed by supernatural threats. "My grandson's claim to the throne cannot be maintained if the realm faces extinction," Tywin continued. his admission carrying weight that few would have believed possible from the proud Lannister patriarch. "I propose a regency that acknowledges your authority while preserving my family's honor and ensuring that our combined resources can be directed toward genuine threats." The terms they negotiated reflected a pragmatism that would have seemed like betrayal to their respective followers, but which represented the only path forward that offered hope of survival for either house. Joffrey would remain king in name, but real authority would pass to a council dominated by lords who understood the magnitude of the challenges facing the realm. More importantly, the Lannister gold that had purchased so many loyalties would now be directed toward preparations for conflicts that would require resources on a scale that individual houses could never manage alone. The vast wealth of Casterly Rock, combined with the military expertise of the North and the strategic knowledge accumulated by the custodians, created the foundation for a resistance that might actually have a chance of success. But the most significant aspect of the Northern Alliance went beyond the practical necessities of military cooperation and resource sharing. The partnership between Stark and Lannister served as a signal to other houses that the time for traditional feuds and regional rivalries had ended. Lords who had been preparing for civil war found themselves instead facing the prospect of cooperation with enemies who had seemed irreconcilable just days earlier. Stannis Baratheon's response to these developments proved characteristic of the man's rigid sense of duty and justice. His message, delivered by Raven to the Red Keep within hours of learning about the new alliance, acknowledged the validity of the supernatural threats while maintaining his own claims to legitimate authority. "If the realm faces the dangers you describe," his letter stated, "then it requires leadership by those who understand duty and sacrifice. I will bring my forces to bear against these ancient enemies, but I will not abandon my rightful claim to serve the political convenience of houses that gained power through treachery and deception." The Baratheon brothers' position created complications that threatened to undermine the fragile unity that Ned and Tywin had begun constructing, but it also provided opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them. Stannis' reputation for competence and incorruptibility made him a valuable ally against supernatural threats, even if his political inflexibility created challenges for conventional diplomacy. The solution came through Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, whose loyalty to Stannis was matched only by his practical understanding of what survival required. The smuggler-turned-lord arrived in King's Landing with proposals that acknowledged his master's claims while creating frameworks for cooperation that preserved everyone's honor and dignity. "Lord Stannis will serve as Lord Protector of the realm," Davos explained to the assembled council, acknowledging the current king while exercising authority necessary to address threats that transcend normal political considerations. The arrangement serves legitimate claims while creating unity of command essential for the conflicts ahead. Even more crucial to the alliance's success was the integration of forces that had been developing independently of the Southern Kingdom's political struggles. The Night's Watch, under Lord Commander Mormont's leadership, officially requested support that went far beyond the traditional donations of food and equipment that had sustained them for centuries. "We need trained soldiers, siege engines, and supplies for a war that may last years," Mormont declared during his appearance before the newly formed War Council. "The enemy we face cannot be defeated by a few hundred Black Brothers armed with whatever weapons we can beg from Southern lords. This requires the full resources of the realm directed toward a threat that will consume us all if we fail." The integration of the Night's Watch into the broader alliance created precedents that challenged fundamental assumptions about the organization's independence and neutrality. For centuries, the Brothers in Black had remained apart from the political conflicts that divided the realm, but the magnitude of the threat beyond the wall made such separation not just impractical but actively dangerous. More surprisingly, support for the Northern Alliance came from across the Narrow Sea in forms that few would have anticipated. Daenerys Targaryen, through representatives who arrived with her dragons visible on the horizon as proof of their authority, offered cooperation that transcended the traditional enmity between Stark and Targaryen houses. The Mother of Dragons acknowledges that the realm faces enemies that care nothing for the disputes between competing dynasties, her envoy announced. She offers her dragons and her armies in service of humanity's survival, asking only that those she aids remember their debts when the immediate crisis has passed. The Targaryen offer created both opportunities and complications for the alliance that Ned was trying to build. Dragons represented military assets that could prove decisive against supernatural enemies, but accepting help from a claimant to the Iron Throne raised questions about legitimacy and future obligations that threatened to fracture the fragile unity he had achieved. The solution required compromises that challenged everyone's preconceptions about honor, legitimacy, and political necessity. Daenerys would be acknowledged as a legitimate heir to House Targaryen, but her claims to the Iron Throne would be deferred until after the immediate supernatural threats had been addressed. Her forces would serve under the Alliance's unified command structure, but she would retain autonomous authority over her dragons and her personal armies. Perhaps most importantly, the Alliance created mechanisms for sharing intelligence and resources that had never existed before in Westerosi history. The Citadel's archives were open to scholars from across the known world, revealing knowledge that had been hoarded for centuries by maesters who viewed information as their exclusive domain. The Faith's extensive network of septons and scepters became a communication system that could coordinate activities across vast distances without relying on ravens that might be intercepted or delayed. Even the criminal organizations that operated in the shadows of legitimate society found themselves drawn into the Alliance's expanding network. The Faceless Men, through intermediaries whose identities remained carefully concealed, offered services that went beyond their traditional role as assassins. Their shape-changing abilities and extensive intelligence networks made them invaluable for gathering information about enemy activities and infiltrating organizations that threatened the Alliance's goals. The result was a coalition that incorporated every significant power center within the known world, from the ancient houses of Westeros to the merchant princes of the free cities to the religious movements that commanded the loyalty of millions of common folk. The diversity of the Alliance created challenges that conventional military organizations had never faced, but it also provided capabilities that no single kingdom could match. As autumn deepened and the first hints of winter appeared in the changing leaves and shortening days, the Northern Alliance began implementing preparations that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Ancient castles that had stood empty for centuries were reoccupied and fortified. Weapons that had been dismissed as ceremonial curiosities were studied and reproduced by smiths who worked with metals and techniques that pushed the boundaries of known craft. Most importantly, the Alliance began training forces for types of warfare that living memory had never encompassed. Soldiers learned to fight enemies that could not be killed by conventional means, while commanders studied tactics for battles where traditional concepts of victory and defeat might prove meaningless. The transformation of Westeros, from a collection of feuding kingdoms into a unified military machine, represented an achievement that surpassed anything accomplished by Aegon the Conqueror or any ruler who had followed him. But the cost of this unity was measured in sacrificed principles and abandoned traditions that had defined the realm's character for thousands of years. As winter's approach brought news of increased activity beyond the wall and disturbing reports from across the narrow sea, Ned realized that the alliance he had helped create represented humanity's last hope for survival. The Game of Thrones had evolved into something that transcended politics entirely, becoming a desperate struggle to preserve civilization itself against forces that viewed human ambition and rivalry as weaknesses to be exploited rather than strengths to be respected. The cost of living when the world believed you dead revealed itself in ways that Ned had never anticipated during his weeks of hiding in the shadows of King's Landing. As autumn deepened into the first bitter winds of approaching winter, he found himself standing in the godswood of the Red Keep, staring at the heart tree, whose ancient face seemed to judge him for choices that honor alone could never have justified. The reunion with his family had brought joy beyond measure, but it had also illuminated the fundamental changes that survival had wrought in all of them. Sansa, once eager to please and desperate for acceptance at court, now moved through the halls of power with calculation that rivaled Cersei Lannister's own political instincts. The innocent girl who had dreamed of knights and songs had died during her father's supposed execution, replaced by a young woman who understood that survival required skills that no scepter had ever taught. "I learned to lie, father," she confessed during one of their private conversations, her voice carrying neither pride nor shame, but simple acknowledgement of necessity. "I learned to watch faces and listen for the words people don't speak. I learned that trust is a luxury that can cost lives when given too freely." Her transformation reflected changes that had rippled through every level of Westerosi society since the revelation of supernatural threats and the formation of the Northern Alliance. The comfortable certainties that had once governed relationships between lords and subjects, between families and rivals, between friends and enemies, had been shattered by the recognition that traditional loyalties might prove meaningless when faced with existential dangers. Arya's metamorphosis proved even more dramatic, her natural wildness having been honed into something approaching the lethal precision of a faceless man. The skills she had learned during her time among Braavos's legendary assassins served the Alliance well, but they had cost her something essential that Ned struggled to define. She moved like a wolf but thought like a viper, her loyalty to family unchanged, but her methods transformed by necessities that would have horrified the child who had once begged him for sword lessons. "The many-faced god taught me that death is a gift," she told him during one of their walks through the castle's quieter corridors. "But I've learned that sometimes the living need gifts more than the dead do. The skills I've gained serve our cause, even if they've changed who I am." The changes in his children reflected broader transformations that had affected everyone touched by the events surrounding his survival and the subsequent revelations about ancient threats. Honor remained important, but it had been tempered by pragmatism in ways that would have seemed like corruption to the man who had first ridden south to serve as Robert's hand. Even more challenging was his evolving relationship with Catelyn, whose grief at his supposed death had been replaced by a fierce determination that sometimes alarmed him with its intensity. The woman who had once counseled caution and restraint now advocated for strategies that pushed the boundaries of acceptable conduct, her maternal instincts having been weaponized by the recognition that their enemies would show no such restraint when the time came for final confrontation. "We cannot afford to lose because we were too noble to do what survival required," she argued during one of the Alliance's strategic planning sessions. "Our children's lives depend on victory, not on maintaining the purity of our methods. Honor that leads to extinction serves no one." The philosophical challenges posed by these transformations extended far beyond personal relationships to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of leadership and moral responsibility. The alliance that Ned had helped forge required cooperation with individuals and organizations whose methods would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The integration of faceless men into the Alliance's intelligence operations provided capabilities that conventional spying could never match. But it also meant accepting that some problems would be solved through assassination rather than negotiation or military action. The pragmatic necessity of such arrangements conflicted with every instinct that had guided Ned's previous approach to politics and warfare. Similarly, the financial support provided by the Iron Bank of Braavos came with strings attached that compromised the Alliance's independence in subtle but significant ways. The Braavosi bankers viewed their investment as a business arrangement rather than a moral crusade, and their expectations for repayment would eventually require decisions that prioritized economic considerations over purely strategic ones. Perhaps most troubling were the compromises required to maintain unity among the Alliance's diverse membership. Lords who had been enemies for generations found themselves forced to cooperate in ways that demanded suppression of legitimate grievances and ancient grudges. The price of such cooperation was often paid by victims of past injustices who were asked to set aside their claims for justice in service of greater necessities. The religious dimension of these compromises proved particularly complex, as the alliance's membership included followers of the Seven, adherents to the old gods, servants of R'hllor, and even individuals who had embraced more exotic faiths encountered in their travels across the narrow sea. Creating frameworks for cooperation among such diverse beliefs required theological accommodations that satisfied no one completely while preventing open conflict that could fracture the coalition. The military aspects of the alliance presented their own moral challenges, as conventional rules of warfare proved inadequate for conflicts involving supernatural enemies. Soldiers trained to fight human opponents had to learn tactics for engaging foes that could not be killed by normal means, that felt no pain, and that used weapons and abilities that defied natural law. The psychological toll of such training manifested in ways that military commanders had never been forced to address. Men who had proven their courage against conventional enemies sometimes broke under the strain of preparing for battles where traditional concepts of honor and valor might prove meaningless. The alliance's leaders found themselves dealing with desertion rates that reflected not cowardice but rather the fundamental human difficulty of accepting realities that challenged every assumption about the nature of existence. The economic costs of preparation for supernatural warfare strained resources that had been accumulated over generations of careful stewardship. Weapons effective against otherworldly enemies required materials and crafting techniques that were both expensive and time-consuming. Fortifications designed to withstand unconventional assault methods demanded innovations that pushed the boundaries of available engineering knowledge. The social disruption caused by mobilization for existential warfare created challenges that went far beyond military logistics. Families separated by the demands of alliance service faced uncertainties that peacetime had never imposed. Traditional seasonal patterns of work and rest were abandoned in favor of preparations that recognized no calendar except the approaching threat. The legal framework that had governed relationships between different social classes required fundamental revision to accommodate the alliance's needs. Ancient privileges and obligations that had defined the feudal system for centuries proved inadequate for organizing resistance against enemies that recognized no distinction between noble and common blood. The intellectual costs of accepting supernatural reality forced scholars and religious leaders to abandon worldviews that had provided comfort and certainty for generations. Masters trained in natural philosophy found themselves studying texts that described phenomena their education had taught them to dismiss as superstition. Septons and scepters discovered that their theological understanding required expansion to encompass threats that their traditional teachings had not prepared them to address. The emotional price of these transformations weighed most heavily on those who remembered the world as it had been before the return of magic and the revelation of ancient enemies. The comfortable certainties of conventional politics and warfare, however flawed, had provided frameworks for understanding human behavior and predicting outcomes. The new reality offered no such comfort, demanding acceptance of possibilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of power and mortality. Ned's personal struggle with these changes reflected broader challenges faced by everyone who had lived through the transformation from conventional political conflict to existential warfare. The man who had once believed that honor and duty provided sufficient guidance for all situations now found himself making decisions that would have horrified his younger self. Yet perhaps the most difficult aspect of the price demanded by survival was the recognition that the changes forced upon them by circumstances were not temporary accommodations that could be abandoned once immediate threats had been addressed. The skills learned, the alliances forged, and the moral compromises accepted in service of survival had become permanent alterations to their characters and their society. The world that would emerge from the coming conflicts, regardless of their outcome, would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before magic returned and ancient enemies stirred. The innocence that had been lost could never be recovered, and the comfortable illusions that had once provided security had been shattered beyond repair. As winter's approach brought increasingly urgent reports of supernatural activity beyond the wall and disturbing intelligence from across the narrow sea, Ned understood that the price of survival would continue to escalate until final victory or ultimate defeat rendered further payment unnecessary. The question that haunted his private moments was whether anything worth preserving would remain of the civilization they were fighting to protect. 5 years had passed since the great trial that transformed the Seven Kingdoms from feuding realms into a unified force against darkness. And the scars of that transformation had become permanent features of Westerosi civilization, from the battlements of Winterfell, where Ned Stark now stood as Lord Protector of the Northern Reaches. The world bore little resemblance to the one he had known during his youth under his father's guidance. The wall, once a massive barrier of ice and stone that had stood unchanged for thousands of years, now stretched higher and stronger than ever before, reinforced with materials that glowed faintly in moonlight and resonated with energies that few living men understood. The ancient fortification had been transformed from a simple physical barrier into something approaching a magical construct, its defenses enhanced by knowledge recovered from Valyrian texts and powered by forces that made even learned maesters uncomfortable. The victory against the others had come at costs that continued to reverberate through every aspect of society. Entire regions beyond the wall remained uninhabitable, their landscapes twisted by supernatural energies that would require generations to fade. The survivors of those battles carried memories that aged them beyond their years, veterans whose eyes held knowledge of things that mortal minds were never meant to witness. Jon Snow, revealed during the conflict to be the prophesied prince whose bloodline had made him crucial to humanity's survival, now ruled as king beyond the wall, with authority that extended over territories that had never known formal government. The bastard boy Ned had raised as his own son had become something between a traditional monarch and a mystical guardian, his responsibilities encompassing both political leadership and supernatural protection of the realm's northernmost boundaries. "The land remembers," Jon had written in his most recent correspondence, the words carrying meanings that went beyond their surface significance. The scars left by the others' presence run deeper than we initially understood. We're learning to work with what the conflict changed rather than trying to restore what was lost. The relationship between father and son had evolved in ways that reflected the broader changes affecting all family bonds throughout the realm. Traditional patterns of inheritance and succession had been modified to accommodate the reality that some positions of leadership required qualifications that bloodline alone could not provide. Jon's unique heritage and proven capabilities had earned him responsibilities that no conventional lord could have claimed, but they had also isolated him from the normal human relationships that most men took for granted. In the south, Daenerys Targaryen ruled from a rebuilt King's Landing whose architecture incorporated design elements that would have seemed impossible before the return of dragons to the world. The Iron Throne had been replaced by a seat of power that reflected the alliance between ice and fire that had proven necessary for victory against ancient enemies. Her dragons, now fully grown and trained for purposes that went beyond simple warfare, served as both symbols of royal authority and practical tools for maintaining the supernatural defenses that protected the realm. The Targaryen queen's marriage to Aegon, the young man whose true identity had been revealed during the conflict to be another crucial piece in the prophetic puzzle, had created a dynastic stability that neither could have achieved alone. Their children, born with bloodlines that combined the best attributes of multiple legendary houses, represented hope for a future where the realm's magical and political needs could be balanced without the constant crisis management that had characterized recent years. Sansa Stark, now Lady of Winterfell in her own right, governed the North with skills that blended traditional leadership with innovations forced by the challenges of rebuilding after supernatural warfare. Her marriage to Tyrion Lannister had surprised many, But the partnership had proven both politically astute and personally fulfilling, combining her diplomatic instincts with his financial acumen and strategic thinking. "We've learned to build for permanence rather than convenience," she reported during the most recent gathering of the Great Council, the expanded governing body that had replaced traditional small council meetings. "The structures we create now must be capable of surviving threats that we've learned to expect, rather than hoping they will remain theoretical possibilities." The Great Council itself represented one of the most significant innovations to emerge from the conflict's aftermath. Rather than concentrating decision-making authority in a single ruler, advised by a small group of councillors, the new system incorporated representatives from every major region and interest group throughout the realm. The unwieldy nature of such broad representation was balanced by its ability to detect and respond to threats that might escape the notice of more centralized authorities. Arya Stark's role within this new structure reflected the unique capabilities she had developed during her training with the Faceless Men and her subsequent service during the supernatural conflicts. Her official title, Mistress of Whispers, barely hinted at responsibilities that encompassed both conventional intelligence gathering and investigations into phenomena that required skills no traditional spy could possess. "The enemies we defeated were not the only threats that existed," she reminded the council during discussions about long-term security measures. "Our victory revealed us to forces that had been content to remain hidden while they believed we were too weak to pose any real challenge. Now we face different dangers that require different types of preparation." The religious landscape of Westeros had undergone transformations that would have seemed impossible before the return of demonstrable divine intervention to the world. The faith of the Seven continued to command widespread allegiance, but it had been forced to acknowledge the reality of other divine powers whose existence could no longer be denied. The resulting theological synthesis satisfied few purists, but provided practical frameworks for cooperation among believers whose supernatural experiences had validated different, but not necessarily contradictory aspects of divine truth. The Citadel, once the undisputed center of learning and knowledge preservation throughout the realm, now functioned as part of a larger network that included institutions established in other kingdoms and cities. The return of magic to the world had required fundamental revisions to educational curricula that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Masters trained in the new system combined traditional skills with capabilities that their predecessors would have considered impossible or dangerous. The economic systems that supported this expanded civilization had been completely restructured to accommodate the resource requirements of permanent magical defenses and supernatural threat monitoring. The Iron Bank of Braavos, having profited enormously from its early investment in the Northern Alliance, now functioned almost as a central bank for the entire known world, its influence extending far beyond simple lending and borrowing arrangements. Trade relationships with the free cities and other foreign powers had been fundamentally altered by Westeros's demonstrated ability to survive and defeat supernatural threats. The realm that had once been viewed as an isolated backwater now commanded respect as a center of knowledge and capability that others sought to emulate rather than exploit. Diplomatic missions from distant lands arrived regularly, seeking alliances and sharing intelligence about similar threats that had begun manifesting in their own territories. The cultural changes accompanying these political and economic transformations had created a society that balanced traditional values with innovations that previous generations would have found shocking. The rigid class distinctions that had once defined social relationships had been softened by the recognition that survival sometimes required talents that could emerge from any background. Merit and capability played larger roles in determining social advancement, though birth and breeding remained significant factors in most circumstances. The military institutions that protected this transformed realm combined conventional forces with specialized units trained for supernatural warfare. The Night's Watch, expanded far beyond its traditional size and scope, now functioned as the realm's primary defense against otherworldly threats while maintaining its traditional role as guardian of the wall. Regular army units throughout the Seven Kingdoms received training in techniques for recognizing and responding to supernatural incursions, ensuring that local threats could be addressed before they required intervention by specialized forces. Perhaps most significantly, the legal systems governing relationships between different social groups had been revised to accommodate realities that traditional law had never contemplated. Courts now included advisors trained in recognizing supernatural influences on human behavior, while legal codes incorporated provisions for dealing with crimes and disputes that involved magical elements or otherworldly considerations. The technological innovations forced by wartime necessities had continued to develop during peacetime, creating capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what previous generations had believed possible. Weapons and defenses that incorporated magical elements were produced by craftsmen whose skills combined traditional techniques with knowledge recovered from ancient sources. Communication systems that allowed rapid coordination across vast distances utilized methods that would have seemed like pure fantasy just decades earlier. The personal costs of these transformations continued to affect everyone who had lived through the transition from the old world to the new. Ned himself bore scars that went beyond the physical marks left by battles against supernatural enemies. The moral compromises required for survival had changed him in ways that sometimes made him feel like a stranger to his younger self, though he had learned to accept these changes as necessary prices for the preservation of everything he held dear. As he stood on Winterfell's walls, watching the aurora-like displays that now regularly appeared in the northern sky as a result of the magical energies still flowing through the region, Ned reflected on the strange path that had led from his near execution in King's Landing to his current role as guardian of a realm that bore little resemblance to the one he had been born to serve. The world his grandchildren would inherit would be one where magic and politics intertwined as naturally as seasons changed, where threats from beyond the known world required constant vigilance, and where the comfortable certainties of traditional life had been replaced by the dynamic challenges of an age where anything seemed possible. It was not the world he had expected to leave behind, but it was one where honor and duty remained relevant, even as their applications had evolved to meet unprecedented circumstances. The last light of evening painted the godswood of Winterfell in shades of gold and crimson as Ned Stark walked the familiar paths of his childhood for what he knew would be among his final times. Age had finally caught up with the man who had survived an execution, forged impossible alliances, and helped guide humanity through its darkest hour since the long night. At 73, his step remained steady, but his hair had turned completely white, and his eyes held the weight of memories that spanned transformation beyond anything his ancestors could have imagined. The heart tree that had witnessed countless generations of Stark lords stood unchanged despite everything that had altered around it, its ancient face carved in living wood, still bearing the same expression of serene wisdom that had comforted him as a boy. The red leaves rustled in evening breezes that carried scents of approaching snow, the first harbinger of another winter that would be met with preparations unimaginable during his youth. His grandson Brandon, named for the uncle he had never known, played among the roots with the easy confidence of a child who had grown up in a world where magic and politics intertwined as naturally as seasons changed. At 8 years old, the boy already showed signs of the supernatural sensitivity that had become increasingly common among children born after the great conflicts, his ability to sense otherworldly presences making him valuable to the realm's ongoing security efforts. "Grandfather," Brandon called, his young voice carrying the musical quality that had become associated with those touched by supernatural awareness. "The tree says something important is coming. Not bad, but big enough to change everything again." Ned smiled at the boy's casual mention of communication with ancient powers, a reminder of how completely the world had transformed since his own childhood, when such abilities had been relegated to old wives' tales and stories told around winter fires. The barriers between the natural and supernatural worlds had never fully reformed after the other's defeat, leaving humanity forever changed by exposure to forces that previous generations had experienced only in legends. The approaching footsteps that disturbed the Godswood's quiet belonged to Jon Snow, though the title by which he was now known throughout the known world carried far more weight than the bastard name he had borne during his youth. The king beyond the wall had aged more slowly than normal men, his unique heritage having granted him longevity that would allow him to serve as guardian of the realm's northern borders for decades to come. "Father," Jon said, using the title that remained accurate regardless of blood relationships, "the Council of Guardians has reached consensus about the Eastern expansion. The Free Cities have formally requested assistance in establishing their own supernatural defense networks, and the Citadel believes we have the resources to support such an undertaking." The conversation that followed reflected the routine nature of decisions that would have seemed impossible during Ned's youth. The realm's capabilities had expanded to the point where it could offer meaningful assistance to distant lands facing their own supernatural threats, making Westeros a center of expertise that attracted scholars and leaders from across the known world. The network of alliances that had begun with the desperate cooperation forged during humanity's darkest hour had evolved into a complex web of relationships that spanned continents. Trade in knowledge and resources flowed along routes that connected civilizations that had previously existed in isolation, creating possibilities for advancement that no single kingdom could have achieved alone. "The world grows smaller every year," Ned observed, settling onto a stone bench that had been carved from rock that had once formed part of the wall itself. "When I was young, Braavos seemed as distant as the moon. Now children speak casually about journeys that would have taken their great-grandfathers months to complete." The transportation innovations that had emerged from wartime necessities continued to develop during peacetime, creating networks that allowed rapid movement of people and goods across vast distances. Ships that incorporated magical enhancements could traverse the narrow sea in days rather than weeks, while overland routes protected by supernatural defenses eliminated many of the dangers that had once made travel a perilous undertaking. The economic prosperity that had followed the realm's transformation into a center of supernatural expertise provided resources that supported not only military preparedness but also cultural and intellectual advancement. Artists and scholars from distant lands came to study techniques and perspectives that had emerged from humanity's encounter with otherworldly forces, creating a renaissance of creativity that drew inspiration from sources that had been inaccessible to previous generations. The religious synthesis that had developed from the necessity of cooperation among different faiths had matured into philosophical frameworks that satisfied spiritual needs while acknowledging supernatural realities that could not be denied. The ancient Godswood, where Ned now sat, had become a pilgrimage destination for believers from throughout the known world, its atmosphere of peace and wisdom offering comfort to those seeking meaning in an age where the boundaries between the possible and impossible had been permanently blurred. The children and grandchildren who would inherit this transformed world possessed capabilities and perspectives that would have seemed magical to their ancestors. Brandon's casual conversation with ancient spirits represented just one example of abilities that had become increasingly common among the younger generation, suggesting evolutionary adaptations that might allow humanity to thrive in an age where supernatural forces played active roles in daily life. "The realm endures," Ned said, repeating words that had sustained House Stark through centuries of hardship and triumph. "But more than that, it grows and adapts and learns. The world our descendants will know will be one where the impossible becomes routine, where threats we barely survived become opportunities for advancement." The approaching darkness brought with it the soft glow of lights that had become common throughout the realm, illumination that drew its power from sources that combined traditional craftsmanship with recovered magical techniques. The technology that had emerged from necessity during wartime had evolved into conveniences that improved daily life for everyone from the highest lords to the most common farmers. As night settled over Winterfell, Ned made his way back toward the castle's great hall, where family and retainers would gather for the evening meal that had remained a constant throughout all the changes that had transformed their world. The conversations around the long tables would include discussions of trade negotiations with the Summer Isles, reports from the Citadel about new discoveries in ancient texts, and updates from the various magical research facilities that had been established throughout the realm. The stability that had emerged from chaos provided a foundation upon which future generations could build achievements that would surpass anything their ancestors had imagined. The threats that had once seemed existential had been transformed into manageable challenges that required ongoing vigilance but no longer posed fundamental dangers to civilization's survival. The peace that Ned had helped create was not the static tranquility of a world without conflict, but rather the dynamic balance of a civilization that had learned to incorporate magical realities into everyday life, while maintaining the values and traditions that gave existence meaning beyond mere survival. Honor and duty remained relevant concepts, though their applications had evolved to encompass responsibilities that earlier generations could never have conceived. The quiet satisfaction that filled his thoughts as he settled by the Great Hall's fire came not from achievements that history would remember, but from the knowledge that the world he would leave behind was one where his children and their children could pursue lives of meaning and purpose without facing the existential threats that had defined his own experience. The warmth of the hearth, the familiar voices of family members discussing the day's events, and the comfortable weight of responsibilities that had been passed to younger hands created an atmosphere of contentment that few men were privileged to experience. The Game of Thrones that had once threatened to consume everything he valued had evolved into something approaching genuine governance, where wisdom and capability mattered more than ambition and ruthlessness. Outside Winterfell's walls, the aurora lights that had become a permanent feature of northern skies danced in patterns that suggested celebration rather than warning, a reminder that the magical forces that had once brought terror to the realm had been integrated into the natural order in ways that enhanced rather than threatened human civilization. The last thought that occupied Ned's mind as sleep began to claim him was gratitude for having lived to see the transformation of fear into wonder, of desperate survival into confident prosperity, and of ancient enemies into the foundation for achievements that would echo through ages yet to come. The wolf had not merely survived the game, but had helped transform it into something worthy of the sacrifices made by all who had played their parts in humanity's greatest triumph.